You are listening to WRFG Atlanta. WRFG provides a voice for those who have been traditionally denied open access to the broadcast media through the involvement of a broad base of community elements to guarantee that access. In the utilization of the facilities and its programs, the following communities will receive first priority: those who continue to be denied free and open access to the broadcast media, and those who suffer oppression or exploitation based upon class, race, sex, age, creed, disability, sexual orientation, or immigrant status.
All right, my name is Heather Gray, and the program is Just Peace, and I want to welcome you all to our program this evening. I'm pleased to say we're going to be talking with Dr. Gerald Horne, largely about his work on reflections about W.E.B. Du Bois. But I want to say that Dr. Gerald Horne is an acclaimed historian and professor at the University of Houston. He is the author of dozens of books, including his most recent works, The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery and Jim Crow and the Roots of American Fascism, and The Dawning of the Apocalypse, The Roots of Slavery, White Supremacy and Capitalism in the Long 16th Century. What an amazing accomplishment. I know you've written tons of books. How many books have you written, Gerald Horne?
Oh, I guess about 3 dozen or so.
My goodness. Well, I need to say I'm just thrilled to have this opportunity to talk with you this evening. And what I'd like to focus on this evening, although we could get into any number of topics, but is about W.E.B. Du Bois and your work on him and your reflections about his work. I'm just curious, when did you start getting an interest in W.E.B. Du Bois?
Well, that's a good question. First of all, there would be an interest. And then second of all, there would be the question of interest in writing about him. Able to answer the second question more easily. A former student of mine was just out at Stanford looking at the papers of Herbert Aptheker. You may recall that Herbert Aptheker, the late historian who wrote about slave revolts, among other subjects, was very close to Du Bois. And in the mid-1970s, I was in New York and I was collaborating with Aptheker. And there's a letter from myself to Aptheker, I think it's from 1977, outlining what I plan to research about Du Bois. And since Aptheker was editing the Du Bois papers, which are now on microfilm, which means they're available all over the place, not least in Atlanta, Georgia. And my first project was looking at his life post-1944. Recall that he had founded the NAACP circa 1909, circa 1910.
This is Du Bois who founded it, right? That's what you're
That is absolutely correct.
Yeah, exactly.
And that he had stayed with the NAACP as his principal propagandist, if I can use that term neutrally, up until about 1934. That is to say, he was the editor of The Crisis, their periodical, which was to be found all over the world. And he had disputes with NAACP leadership and moved to Atlanta University circa 1934. And that's where one of his most significant works was produced. I'm speaking of Black Reconstruction, his reconsideration of the period following the U.S. Civil War, which turned that whole historiography upside down and has led to the modern conception that Reconstruction was a noble attempt to install and insert democracy post 1865, post the end of the U.S. Civil War, not least in places like Georgia, but then was overturned by the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, and also a kind of conciliation within racial lines, across class lines in the Euro-American community. And that book came out shortly after returning to Atlanta University. But then by 1944, he had a dispute with the leadership of the Atlanta University complex, which allows him to return with the NAACP in 1944 as this kind of Minister of Foreign Affairs. This is in the midst of World War II, when there are stirrings in the colonized world, Africa and the Caribbean not least. And Du Bois's role was to be the chief Black American liaison with these anti-colonial movements. And what I had written Aptheker about, and of course Aptheker, as noted earlier, was quite close to Du Bois, was doing research on that period from 1944 up until the time in 1950, 1951, when Du Bois was indicted at the age of 83 for being the alleged agent of a foreign power because of his leadership in the ban the bomb movement, that is to say, the banning of nuclear weapons. Speaking of the Stockholm Peace Appeal, as it was called, the United States at that time considered the banning of nuclear weapons as a kind of communist plot. Du Bois was put on trial and barely escaped prison. Now, perhaps I should go back.
We will go back, but after that, he ended up going to Africa, right?
Well, what happens is that he goes to Africa about a decade later, in 1961, with his second wife, Shirley Graham, who I've also written about. I would point your listeners to my book, Race Woman, The Lives of Shirley Graham Du Bois, which not only deals with her and her relationship with Du Bois, but also him within that context. So from about the acquittal, circa 1951, on these federal charges, up until for a decade, he was living in New York, in Brooklyn, and was a kind of pariah, an outcast with regard to the United States, because as quite unusually, even today, I'm afraid to say, he was a Black intellectual and activist who was interested in the world, interested in foreign affairs. Today, it's quite novel and unusual, I'm afraid to say, to find a Black intellectual or even political leader who is interested in anything beyond the shores of the United States of America.
Well, that's interesting.
Well, yes. And I think one of the reasons is what happens is that Du Bois is an object lesson, is that as a Black person, oftentimes you're going to take a position contrary to the position of Washington and the State Department on foreign policy, and then that can lead to your being indicted. And so I think that's one of the reasons why even in 2022, 2023, it's so unusual to find a Black person who has that kind of interest, because, I mean, just look at the record. Another Atlantan, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., he ran afoul of the U.S. authorities when he came out against the war in Vietnam. Malcolm X ran afoul of the U.S. authorities when he began to tour Africa and speaking to anti-colonial leaders in Ghana in particular. Du Bois's comrade, Paul Robeson, ran afoul of the U.S. authorities when he, during the time that Du Bois fell under indictment, suggested that he didn't think that he would support a U.S. war against the former Soviet Union, which could have been a war that would have led to the extinction of all humanity. So
right.
I think it's sort of understandable why many Black leaders and intellectuals today, or even non-Black leaders and intellectuals, decide to steer clear of these thorny foreign policy questions, because you can get into really hot water.
Yeah, absolutely. Gerald, I'd like to go back to some of the history, the early history of W.E.B. Du Bois, as in where he was born, when he was born. Could we go back to that a little bit?
Sure. Great Barrington, Massachusetts, 1868, the birthplace and year of W.E.B. Du Bois. As a teenager, he moved to Nashville, Tennessee to attend Fisk University, which thankfully is still in existence. From there, he migrated back to Massachusetts to Harvard University, where he received his doctorate. His dissertation published in one of probably his first book, The Suppression of the African Slave Trade, which is still worth consultation.
I tell you what, before you go further on that, though, while he was at Harvard, he ended up going to Germany, right?
I was just about to mention that.
Oh, please, go ahead. What were you going to say? Go ahead, please.
That he spent time at the University of Berlin, where he came.
How did that happen, though? I don't understand how that happened. How was he able to go to Berlin? Was this was something from Harvard or something that they advised him to do this, or how did that work?
Well, I think, as you know, even today, many students decide to study abroad.
Okay.
And at the time, Germany was considered to be one of the advanced capitalist countries, which it is still today. He had studied German, which was not unusual for that time. Germany also had the most advanced socialist movement, to which he was exposed as early as the 1890s. And from there, he came back to the United States and wound up teaching at Wilberforce in Ohio, and also had entertained an idea of teaching at Tuskegee, the institution of the late leader Booker T. Washington. That did not pan out, but he did wind up moving to Atlanta and teaching there. And of course, he was in Atlanta in 1906 at the time of the racist pogrom, the notorious racist pogrom that featured episodes too ghoulish and ghastly to recount today. He also had a relationship with Philadelphia and the University of Pennsylvania that led to some of his first explorations in urban sociology, referring to not only the Philadelphia Negro, but also some of the studies that he did during that time, which involved a kind of field work, that is to say, circulating in the Black community there, knocking on doors and taking down interviews and then writing up his findings, complemented by census findings. And he was also involved politically. You may recall the Niagara movement, which is one of the first movements that challenged the hegemony of the ideas of Booker T. Washington and its accommodationism, if you like. The Niagara movement led directly to the formation of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which is still in existence, as you well know. This is about 1909, 1910.
So much remarkable history here. So could you tell us a little bit more about the Niagara movement and the issue that the W.E.B. Du Bois had with Booker T. Washington?
Well, the issue turned largely upon the extent to which the status quo, the racist status quo with regard to Jim Crow and lynching, in particular, lynching being the execution of Black people, not least Black men, in the thousands on spurious grounds, although recent scholarship has pointed to Black women also being lynched, and not least in Georgia, by the way. And Booker T. Washington, oftentimes, as recent scholarship has suggested, was sometimes challenging this unequal status quo, but oftentimes under the table, oftentimes surreptitiously. However, it was the opinion of Du Bois and the Niagara movement that to really confront and overturn this status quo of iniquity, that it had to be done frontally, not necessarily just under the table. And that led to this rift And also, interestingly enough, I mentioned a moment or two ago how one of his most significant works, speaking of Black Reconstruction, comes out of his time in Atlanta. The same could be said for a challenger to that title of significant work of Du Bois, speaking of the souls of Black folk, which too has Atlanta fingerprints all over it. And Atlanta, during that time, as I'm sure many of your audience know, contrary to the slogan of a few decades ago, was most decidedly not a city too busy to hate, but as reflected in the 1906 pogrom, was a city of horrors for Black people in particular. And this is something that Du Bois felt needed to be challenged frontally.
And that's what he did.
Absolutely.
So how did he do this? And in terms of what he wrote, but other actions in the city of Atlanta, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, what he wrote, the propaganda in the neutral sense, but this led directly to the NAACP, and this led to an organization that was involved in marching and petitioning, in lobbying Congress. The NAACP early on was lobbying for an anti-lynching law, a federal anti-lynching law, which came up short because this is a lesson that I've stressed in my work, and I ties back to what I mentioned a moment or two ago, which is that if you're in politics, ideally you should do an analysis of the forces on the ground. For example, you should do an analysis that tells you who could possibly be supportive, who would be hotly opposed, and then develop a strategy based upon that analysis. And as one surveys the Black question in the United States, it's apparent that certainly at that time, and even today, I would argue, that the balance of forces were hostile to equality. And therefore, one had to be involved globally in order to put pressure on Washington to change its wrong-headed course. And this is a lesson of the later life of Du Bois in particular, because post-1944, when he returned to the NAACP, as noted, to become a kind of Minister of Foreign Affairs, he and many others like him recognized that the United States, which was trying to be a global power, by doing so, exposed itself to global currents. We know that post-1945, there's the onset of a U.S. Cold War, an ideological contestation between Washington and the then socialist camp headed by the Soviet Union. Washington was trying to win hearts and minds in the colonized world, Africa not least, awash in resources from gold and diamonds to petroleum. But how could they do so when people of African descent in this country were treated so atrociously as African nations were coming to independence? As I noted in my book on Kenya, one of the milquetoast compromises that the State Department came up with was that when Black envoys and diplomats came to Washington, D.C., they could be given a lapel button to show that they were not Black Americans, and therefore they should not face discrimination in hotels and restaurants and all the rest. But
oh, really? When was that? What year?
The 1950s.
Is that right? Okay.
It's in my Kenya book if people want.
Okay. What's the name of your book about Kenya?
The Kenya book is Mau Mau in Harlem, ? The United States and the Liberation of Kenya.
Okay, thank you.
But I should also say I have a book on Washington, D.C. Coming out in a few months. Revolting City, Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1900 to 2000. And that book has numerous examples of that similar problem faced even before the Cold War. when African students are coming to Howard University. And I imagine you could write a similar book about African students coming to Atlanta University, the Atlanta University complex. And the United States concerned about these folks facing Jim Crow and trying to devise measures that would allow them to be treated not like a third-class person, but perhaps like a second-class person, but certainly not like the indigenous African-American population.
Gerald, I'd like to go back to this pin that folks in the authorities in Washington would give visiting Africans.
They proposed.
Oh, they didn't do it.
No, because it was sort of a loony idea. I mean,
no, I agree, but so they didn't do it. Okay, but that was the proposal. Who turned it down? Congress or other officials in government, or
it was executive and administrative action. That the problem, amongst others, the indigenous Black American community, they could make these pins, just like when you had demonstrations in Maryland, led by Howard University students. You had Howard University students putting on dashikis and speaking in so-called accents from West Africa, so that they could be allowed to eat at restaurants. I mean, these ideas, it's not easy to draw distinctions, simple distinctions between Africans and African Americans. Guess what? They look alike.
Yes.
So
exactly.
So the idea was sort of loony from its inception, but what it bespeaks is the kind of desperation and hysteria that Washington faced trying to maintain this system of apartheid while global currents were blowing in an opposing direction. And so the point that I'm making is that Du Bois, in particular, not only during the Cold War period, post-1945, but also in the earlier period from the onset of the NAACP circa 1909 and 1910, recognized that it had to be a global movement against Jim Crow, against U.S. apartheid. But as noted, when I referenced the indictment of Du Bois at the age of 83, when Black Americans get involved in the international scene, they inevitably run afoul of the U.S. authorities, which is one of the reasons why that most powerful weapon is not unsheathed today, because people don't want to run afoul of the U.S. authorities, which then gives the whole Black liberation movement the kind of aura of being a kind of phony war. Because when people are fighting in a conflict and they're not unsheathing one of the most potent weapons, you have to question either A, do they really know what they're up against, or B, as the musicians like to say, they're basically just faking the funk.
Wow. So much history here. So how long was W.E.B. Du Bois at Atlanta University?
Well, the first period was in the early part of the 20th century for a few years, and then from 1934 to 1944, as noted.
I see. Okay. So what, in your opinion, did he, here we're talking about this on a radio station in Atlanta, Georgia. So what did he accomplish really in his work at Atlanta University?
Well, as I said, two of his major works were completed in Atlanta, The Souls of Black Folks and Black Reconstruction. Then he was teaching. I mean, so he's influencing students too numerous to mention, shaping the future generations of Black youth by teaching courses in history, teaching courses in sociology, et cetera, teaching courses in African history. Of course, he was also researching and writing in African history during that time. I guess this opens up the door to talking about some of his other work.
Please, go ahead.
Which includes fiction, for example, which includes poetry, which includes studies of African history, for example, includes quite a bit of journalism, particularly during the period from 1909, 1910 to 1934, when he was with the Crisis. In fact, I mentioned Herbert Aptheker a few moments ago, who was a collaborator with Du Bois and who I collaborated with subsequently. And some years ago, he edited a thick volume of Du Bois's published writings. And that is a very valuable reference. I'm sure you can find it at a library in Atlanta somewhere. And if you look at that thick volume on Du Bois's published writings, what you'll quickly find is that a lot of the published writings is journalism. That is to say, commenting on the current issues of the day.
You're listening to the Just Peace program on WRFG Atlanta.
Just like today, if Du Bois were with us, I'm sure he'd be commenting on the Walker-Warnock race. He'd be commenting upon the rise of China. He would be commenting upon the upcoming summit between African leaders and the U.S. authorities in Washington, D.C. And current events were a major preoccupation of Du Bois, be it in Atlanta or be it elsewhere.
Wow. Well, one of the interesting things that I knew nothing about as far as Du Bois is concerned, of course, there's a lot that you said that I didn't know, but you were saying he wrote fiction? I had no idea. What sort of fiction did he write?
Well, he wrote fiction that oftentimes dealt with global questions, that oftentimes dealt with, for example, the issues between Black Americans and India. As you probably know, Du Bois said that Indian independence, August 1947, was one of the most significant events in world history. He had a preoccupation with India. And you may be familiar with the book that I wrote on the relationship between India and Black Americans, which goes into that question in some detail.
What's the name of the book?
The End of Empires, African Americans and India. It came out a few years ago.
Okay, thank you.
And so in some ways, this fiction was just an extension of his journalism. Because oftentimes, one of the reasons why intellectuals and writers turn to fiction is because when you're writing history, oftentimes the record is not very revelatory, not very revealing with regard to the motivation of leading figures. I mean, for example, speaking of Atlanta, I was just doing an interview with another broadcaster about another Atlantan who is lesser known than Du Bois. I'm speaking of Lawrence Dennis, who was born a Negro in Georgia in the 1890s, but he was lighter skinned and melanin deficient and chose to pass, that is to say, to cross the color line and to present himself as, quote, white, unquote, and went on to become the intellectual leader of U.S. fascism in the 1930s. Now, the record is not very clear with regard to all of its motivations along the line as to what motivated him to turn towards fascism in particular. And I was suggesting to this other broadcaster that a novelist or a screenplay writer could probably be more illustrative in that regard because they're not necessarily bound by the historical record. They can just make stuff up. Or I should say, make stuff up based upon reasonable inferences from the historical record, to be more precise. And so with regard to Bois's fiction, that's basically what he was doing. He was, rather than being handcuffed by the historical record and being able to footnote precisely every statement, which is what you do in history, you just draw inferences and create characters. And this is particularly important with regard to motivation, because as you may know, an actor, be it on stage or in cinema, one of the first questions when playing a character that you pose to the director or the producer even is, what's my motivation? And it's up to the director to sketch that out, or it's up to you to try to figure it out. And when you're writing biography and you're writing about historical figures that have pass from the scene, one of your jobs as a historian is to figure out their motivation. But that's not easy if the record does not point you in that direction. So that's why intellectuals turn to fiction. That's why Du Bois turned to fiction.
Interesting. Well, I'm curious your opinion about the impact and influence of W.E.B. Du Bois. I mean, in the Black community, but in the United States and or the world generally. What is your opinion? Is that too broad a question? But what was his impact and his influence on policies ultimately, like say with the NAACP or wherever you would like to approach this, Gerald? But I'd just like to know how influential he was, really.
So let's start with the Pan-African movement. This was this idea that people of African descent had commonalities, be it in particular with regard to exploitation, be it in the colonized world, be it in terms of the legacy of the unlamented African slave trade, and that was the basis for a common struggle. As early as the early 1900s, Du Bois was involved in organizing these Pan-African conferences or congresses where people of African descent would gather. Now, there are those who would quarrel with the idea of Du Bois being the so-called father of Pan-Africanism, Henry Sylvester Williams of Trinidad and Tobago, Edward Blyton, whose roots are in the Virgin Islands, could easily be given that title. But in any case, with regard to these Pan-African Congresses, it's fair to say that Du Bois was preeminent and paramount in organizing. Now, one of the most important Pan-African Congresses he organized takes place, once again, during his second tenure with the NAACP. I'm speaking of the Pan-African Congress in Manchester, England, UK, circa 1945, where you had an ingathering of many African leaders and the Caribbean leaders as well, who post-1945 would lead their countries to independence. Du Bois was preeminent in organizing that conference. And it's fair to say that one of the most important developments for people of African descent generally, including in North America, was the independence of Africa. Because refer to my previous point with regard to how Washington found it necessary to move away from the more egregious aspects of Jim Crow, including lynching, because of this desire to improve relations with independent Africa post-1945, given Africa's paramountcy in terms of being awash with natural resources. So these Pan-African Congresses were extraordinarily important. And then domestically, these struggles that the NAACP was involved in, that Du Bois helped to shape, these are struggles around anti-lynching. These are struggles against residential segregation. These are struggles with regard to improving education. These are extraordinarily important struggles. And he was at the tip of the spear, as noted, from 1909 to 1934.
Oh, well, thank you for that. And his work, his international work, even when he went to Ghana, was it still ongoing?
Du Bois moves to Ghana, West Africa, in 1961, as noted. This is at the invitation of the founding father, Kwame Nkrumah. Ghana comes to independence circa 1957. Kwame Nkrumah was very close to Du Bois. Du Bois's purpose, by then he's in his 90s, in going to Ghana, in part, was to initiate this Encyclopedia Africana. I should mention in this context that Ghana had become a site of exile for many Black Americans, not only Du Bois and his spouse, Shirley Graham Du Bois, but also the architect Max Bond, who you may note has roots in Atlanta as well. And Maya Angelou, for example, the late writer and dancer and intellectual, was in Ghana at that time, and many others as well. And this lasted for quite a while. Speaking of from 1957, Ghana coming to independence, to 1966, when Nkrumah was overthrown as a result of a coup that was smiled upon minimally by the U.S. authorities, and that also implicated the U.S. ambassador to Ghana at that time, speaking of the former NAACP leader, Franklin Williams, who, of course, denied complicity, although recent evidence suggests that his denials cannot necessarily be taken seriously. And that bespeaks an ideological rift within the Black community, which has hardly been addressed. I address it in my book, White Supremacy Confronted, U.S. Imperialism and Anti-Communism versus the Liberation of Southern Africa, from Rhodes to Mandela, where I talk about how in the early 1950s, as the NAACP leadership, which, by the way, ousts Du Bois unceremoniously in 1948 because of political differences. That is to say, the NAACP decided to support the Cold War, support anti-communism. Du Bois did not support either, and that led to their firing him. And which, as noted, then leads to his being indicted in 1950, 1951. But as I talk about in my book on Southern Africa, you have some of the NAACP leaders who in the 1950s collaborating with the CIA, trying to convert African National Congress leaders into being agents of U.S. imperialism, which leads to rifts between the ANC leadership led by Nelson Mandela, not to mention leaders of other liberation movements in the sub-region. And there's a lot of happy talk nowadays with regard to the, quote, role, unquote, that Black Americans and their organizations played in the liberation of Southern Africa, where this history that I recount in my books is generally sort of overlooked or neglected, which is unfortunate, because if you overlook and neglect historical accounts and instead opt for happy talk that makes you feel good about the role, it can be very misleading, because you have to do an analysis of conditions in order to come up with a strategy.
Exactly.
And it's like if you go to a doctor and you've been smoking 3 packs of cigarettes a day for 30 years, and you don't tell the doctor, and he's trying to figure out why you may have emphysema or asthma, he may come up with a shoddy prescription for your health plan. And that's not helpful to you. And so likewise, if you're trying to do an analysis that leads to a strategy, but you decide to sweep under the rug all of these stories that you now feel embarrassed about, you're not going to be able to come up with an adequate strategy, which basically means that you're probably doomed in the long run.
Well, the complexity of all this is really something. I know we're getting close to the end here, but I do have another question, though, about W.E.B. Du Bois. I've been reading some of this recently. It has to do with his position on World War I and the complexity of that as well. He was supporting Black military who were participating in World War I. And then it seemed to me toward the end, Gerald, he started shifting gears on this. I think he was in favor of World War I at first, and then he chose not to be in favor of it. So could you respond to any of that at all? please?
Yeah, that's not an unfair assessment. I mean, first of all, with regard to Du Bois and World War One, you can probably find this online. You can find his article, "The African Roots of War," which is still relevant today in the 21st century, because he talks about how one of the driving forces of that conflict, that Titanic conflict, was European contestation over control of African resources, not least. Britain had stolen a march on other European nations, Germany not least, in terms of controlling colonies. And Germany wanted its place in the sun. It was able to establish colonies in what used to be called Tanganyika, now Tanzania, and Togo, and Cameroon, and Namibia in particular, which was the site in the early 20th century of one of the major genocides in African history and world history. That's formerly German Southwest Africa on the northern border of South Africa. And this contestation over African resources, Du Bois argues in The African Roots of War, is a motive force for World War One. But he's also part of an organization, the NAACP. Many of its leaders, including the Spingarn brothers, were not adverse to being influenced by Washington. And I would argue that this influences Du Bois in a similar direction. And this leads to him making, I would say, some unfortunate decisions with regard to this conflict, which in many ways do not line up with that article, The African Roots of War, because he realized that this was an unjust war, that it was an imperialist war, but yet he was taking positions that were not necessarily congruent with that particular thesis. In any case, he begins to shift. You know that World War One, it lasts roughly from 1914 July, August, till 1918 on the 11th day of the 11th month. That is to say, November 11th, 1918, when an armistice or peace agreement is accorded. And after that, you begin to see, and even a little before that, you begin to see Du Bois shifting. And then, of course, this was not a moment too soon, because what happens post 1918 is an extraordinary rise in pogroms, racist attacks, lynchings, oftentimes against Black men in military uniforms, because the Jim Crow acolytes felt that these Black men had to be put in their place, because as the song of that period goes, how are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris? Or
exactly. How can you control them if they're learning how to fight like this, right? That's what they're saying, essentially.
Well, not only that, but people in the United States, for various reasons, which we could go into if you're interested, oftentimes there's this assumption that Europeans across the board are as backward as the Euro-Americans were during the era of Jim Crow, not recognizing that lynching, in many ways, as a number of historians have pointed out, even hemispherically, is somewhat unique with regard to the backward nature of the United States. Now, that contrasts with the rampant idea on the left, I'm afraid to say, which oftentimes speaks of the United States and this revolt against British rule as this great leap forward for humanity, and then all of the horrors that come afterwards, Native American dispossession, an increase in the enhancement of the African slave trade. As Obama used to say, that's not who we are. And even though people on the left oftentimes criticize that idea, they take the same position. And so it leaves them ill-disposed to figure out why Black American soldiers would be treated better in France than they would be in Georgia. Because the United States is supposed to be this advanced country, but it's so backwards when it comes to Black people. And of course, France has African colonies as well. But then, of course, as you know, or as you may know, with regard to the Europeans, if a person like myself, and I've had this experience, goes to London I'll not necessarily be treated the same way as somebody with a Jamaican or Nigerian accent, for example. That is to say, someone who has roots in a former British colony, because this kind of bigotry is oftentimes a result of a historical circumstance. Just like as I talk about in a number of my books, I hinted at it a few moments ago when I talked about how the U.S. authorities want to give these lapel buttons to visiting Africans. They weren't going to give them any lapel buttons to indigenous African Americans so that they could escape bigotry. I mean, this sort of bigotry, it's oftentimes historically shaped and determined and site-specific. So in any case, you have this extraordinary rise in lynchings and pogroms, East St. Louis, Illinois, Chicago, et cetera. We all know about the Tulsa massacre circa 1921, Rosewood, which comes shortly thereafter, Rosewood, Florida, the subject of a film by the late filmmaker John Singleton. And so obviously by this time, Du Bois has made the crucial adaptation, but I think it's fair to say that World War I and the period surrounding it was not necessarily his finest hour.
Yeah, right. So I just want to ask you before we end this discussion here, which I so appreciate actually, have we seen changes in America as far as racial oppression and so forth is concerned?
Well,
what's your opinion? What's
your timeline? Since last year?
All right. So in in the 21st century, we've seen changes?
In the 21st century? Well, yeah. That means since the year 2000. I would say that do not seem to be improving in the 21st century. Now, if your timeline is since 1950, the answer is yes, clearly, obviously. If your timeline is since 1920, well, yes, clearly, obviously. If your timeline is since 1865, yes. 1765, yes. 1565, yes. The 21st century, since the year 2000, 2001, I'm not so sure.
Why do you say that?
Well, I mean, first of all, you have metrics. I mean, you have benchmarks. I mean, I don't have the figures at the tip of my fingers, but look at the benchmarks and metrics with regard to police killings, death penalty, executions on death row, incarceration rates, infant mortality rates.
Right.
You know, you have all these metrics and benchmarks since the year 2000, 2001. They don't seem to be improving. They do seem to be improving since 1920, however.
Okay. So, all right. You also mentioned 1950. So how have things improved since 1950?
Well, or not? On Atlanta. I mean, Atlanta, of course, was a Jim Crow citadel.
Exactly.
Georgia, if you look at the metrics concerning lynching, Georgia is certainly in the top 2 or 3 with regard to these extrajudicial executions. Once again, you begin to see a retreat as the international situation is altered, and that creates favorable and fertile conditions for Black protests in conjunction with its allies. In other words, you have it's like this dialectic between the external and the internal. That is to say, the external being favorable global conditions that then allows for domestic advance. What's happening today is that many of our organizations and leaders, they're only looking domestically. And sometimes that comes up with victories of a sort, such as the Warnock-Walker struggle, which obviously could have gone in another direction. I'm still waiting to see the statistics concerning voting patterns in that particular race, particularly with regard to Euro-American women. I've been made to understand that a significant percentage of that important cohort voted for Mr. Walker, but I'm waiting for figures to authenticate that assertion. But in any case, victories are oftentimes not assured if one is not taking into account the external climate and trying to develop a strategy that takes into account not only the domestic correlation of forces, but the international correlation of forces.
So we're seeing improvements internationally, are we?
Well, that's a bit more complicated. First of all, the United States obviously is quite concerned with the rise of China. That helps to explain why you're having the summit of African leaders in Washington in mid-December 2022. That helps to explain why the Biden White House has just announced that they want the African Union to have a permanent seat at the table at the Group of 20 meetings. Recall that they just met in Bali, Indonesia, with Biden meeting with Chinese leader Xi Jinping on the sidelines, because there's all this hysteria about the advance that China has made in Africa, and so the United States feels that it has to counter that. The question really becomes, with the incipient decline of U.S. imperialism, which is recognized globally, not necessarily recognized internally, what will that mean in terms of Black American advance? Because when you had the retreat of Jim Crow in the 1950s, this was during a time when the United States was bestriding the planet like a colossus. And it was in a position to make financial and economic concessions. As a matter of fact, you can make an argument, as I did in my book on Watts, Los Angeles, that these financial and economic concessions were ultimately beneficial to capitalism, because if you're improving the income of a certain sector of the Black middle class, that means that they are in a position to buy more automobiles, more refrigerators, more stoves and air conditioners, which then gives a jolt to the economy. Now, that particular factor was ill understood in the 1950s. And I'm not sure, or as a matter of fact, I am certain that in the 21st century, you do not have that many intellectuals, if any, intellectuals, leaders, or organizations that are taking into account global economics when trying to figure out a way forward in terms of the anti-racist movement, in terms of the movement for equality.
Well, Gerald Horne, I want to thank you so much, as always, for your remarkable analysis on all of this. Your detailed analysis is remarkable. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, it's just my pleasure.